There is always one person in a family who keeps the records. The one who sits in the corner holding their tongue and watching the rest of the bloodline behave exactly how they are. People usually mistake the family archivist for a doormat. They never consider that a person taking quiet notes is just preparing for a trial. My name is Daisy Campbell. I am 28 years old. By 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, my Aunt Brenda was sitting at a polished mahogany table at a title company with a fancy pen in her hand. She was smiling for the room, ready to sell my late grandmother's $4 million Poconos cabin to a commercial developer. She claimed she was the executor. She had already used the buyer's $250,000 deposit to reserve a luxury condo for herself in Florida. She had no idea the closing attorney was holding a trust document with a 50-year no-sale clause. She also had no idea I was the one who gave it to him. Before I take you into that conference room and tell you how my aunt lost everything, hit like and subscribe. Welcome to Elderly Stories. Drop your age in the comments below because I want to know what generation is listening today. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you to the room where the theft started. The linoleum floor of room 412 at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner, listening to the mechanical metronome of the ventilator. In and out. It was marking the final hours of Evelyn Campbell's life. I am an archivist by trade. My days are spent at the Philadelphia Historical Society, preserving delicate paper that time has tried to destroy. My job is to notice details, to index them, and to keep quiet. Evelyn had raised me during my childhood summers. While my parents navigated a bitter divorce in Ohio, her sprawling cabin in the Poconos had been my sanctuary. She taught me how to read the rings of a fallen oak tree and how to spot a forgery. She always told me people will show you exactly who they are if you just stay silent long enough to let them. At 3:14 that afternoon, the hospital room door swung open. My Aunt Brenda did not enter a space, she occupied it. The sharp scent of juniper gin and expensive perfume cut through the sterile air a second before her heels struck the floorboards. She was 56, wearing a tailored silk blouse, and carrying a distressed leather handbag she bought on a trip to Milan. It was a trip her maxed-out credit cards were still carrying. The parking structure here is a joke, Brenda announced to the room at large. She did not lower her voice. She did not glance at the heart monitor. I had to circle level C for 20 minutes. You would think they would offer valet for the cardiac wing. "Hello, Aunt Brenda," I said. She waved a hand in my general direction, her gaze finally landing on the frail woman in the hospital bed. Evelyn's chest rose and fell in that steady, artificial rhythm. Brenda stepped closer, leaning over the metal rail. She did not touch her mother's cheek or whisper a goodbye. Instead, her eyes locked onto the dull gleam on Evelyn's left hand, the vintage platinum wedding band and the sapphire engagement ring. "Her knuckles are retaining water," Brenda noted, her tone clinical. "The nurses will have to cut these off if we are not proactive." Before I could uncross my legs, Brenda reached out. With a practiced twisting motion, she slid both rings off Evelyn's pale finger. She dropped them into the side pocket of her Milan handbag. The metal clinked against her car keys. "Just for safekeeping," Brenda said, catching my eye. It was a dare. "Hospitals are full of opportunists, Daisy. You have to be pragmatic." I did not argue. I did not point out that Evelyn was still breathing, that the rings had rested on that finger for 6 decades, or that the only opportunist in the room was holding a designer bag. Conflict with Brenda was a tax I refused to pay. She thrived on resistance because it gave her an excuse to play the victim. To Brenda, I was just the mousy niece in sensible shoes. A spectator to her life, so I just watched. I committed the moment to memory, filing it away in the archives of my mind. Brenda checked her reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off television, adjusting her collar. "I need an espresso. Text me if the baseline changes." She walked out, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. The ventilator hummed. In and out. I reached over and held my grandmother's bare hand. The skin felt cool, The absence of the rings left a small pale indent on her finger, a phantom circle of missing history. The theft of the jewelry was just a prologue. Brenda was already taking inventory of an estate she thought was hers to drain. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and forced condolences. 3 days later, Brenda summoned the remaining bloodline to the Oak Ridge Country Club. Oak Ridge was the kind of establishment that demanded collared shirts and served watered-down mimosas for $25 a glass. Brenda had booked the private sunroom. When I arrived, she was already seated at the head of a long mahogany table, gesturing for a waiter to refill her champagne flute. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer. Next to her plate rested my grandmother's navy blue leather wallet. I watched Brenda pull Evelyn's metallic premium credit card from the slot and drop it onto the leather checkbook presenter. Evelyn had been in the ground for less than 72 hours, and Brenda was already using her account to finance a performance of mourning. My cousin Liam sat to Brenda's left scrolling through his phone. Liam was 30, chronically unemployed, and drove a leased sports car he could not afford. He inherited his mother's financial habits without her ruthless ambition. My uncle David, Brenda's younger brother, sat on her right, looking exhausted. David was an optometrist who preferred to avoid friction at all costs. He stirred his coffee and stared out the window at the putting green. Then there was me seated at the far end of the table near the serving station. I poured myself a glass of ice water and waited for the show to begin. Brenda tapped a silver spoon against her water glass. The sharp ringing cut through the low murmur of the dining room. She cleared her throat, adopting a tone of solemn responsibility. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know this is a difficult time. Mom's passing was a shock to us all." It was not a shock. Evelyn had been declining for a year, but Brenda preferred narratives where she was the resilient survivor of sudden tragedy. Brenda reached into her designer tote bag and produced a thick stack of paper bound by a blue legal cover. The edges of the paper were yellowed. The staple at the top corner was rusted. As an archivist, I handle historical documents daily. I know what age looks like on paper. That document had not seen the light of day in over a decade. "I spoke with the estate attorney this morning," Brenda announced. She slid the document to the center of the table. "This is Mom's last will and testament. It was drafted 15 years ago. As the eldest, I am named as the sole executor. It is a significant undertaking, but I am prepared to bear the weight." David nodded slowly, offering a tired murmur of agreement. Liam did not look up from his screen. Brenda looked directly at me. Her expression softened into a mask of patronizing pity. It was the same look she used when she tipped the country club valet. "Daisy, sweetie," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I know how close you were to your grandmother. She loved having you around during the summers when you were a little girl. I want to make sure you get something special to remember her by." She paused, letting the silence stretch so the rest of the table could admire her generosity. "I was thinking you should have her knitting supplies. The yarn, those beautiful wooden needles she kept in the sunroom, maybe that old rocking chair. Things with sentimental value. The grown-ups will handle the complicated estate matters, the bank accounts, the property. You just focus on your memories." I looked down at my water glass. I felt the familiar urge to correct her. I wanted to tell her that Evelyn stopped knitting 5 years ago due to severe arthritis. I wanted to tell her that I was 28 years old, managing a department at the Historical Society, not a child playing with yarn. But I remembered Evelyn's rule. People will show you exactly who they are if you just stay silent long enough to let them. I raised my head and offered a flat, polite smile. "Thank you, Aunt Brenda," I said. "I would love the knitting supplies." Brenda beamed. She had categorized me as harmless and naive variable she could entirely dismiss. By agreeing with her, I denied her the friction she needed to justify pushing me out. I became invisible. With my compliance secured, Brenda shifted her posture. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The performance transitioned from mourning daughter to practical manager. "Now we have to discuss the realities of Mom's estate," Brenda said, lowering her voice as if sharing a state secret. "There are substantial liabilities. The medical bills alone are staggering. And then there is the property." She let the word hang in the air. The property. She meant the Poconos cabin. Evelyn's cabin was a masterpiece of mid-century craftsmanship, sitting on 40 acres of pristine old-growth timber. It featured a wraparound stone porch, vaulted cedar ceilings, and a private dock on a glacial lake. It was not just a home, it was a sanctuary. I knew the current market value was hovering around $4.6 million. The timber rights alone were worth a fortune. The cabin is a tremendous tax burden. Brenda sighed, shaking her head. The property taxes are astronomical. The upkeep is draining the estate accounts, and the structure itself is practically a liability at this point. The roof needs replacing. The plumbing is ancient. Every word was a fabrication. Evelyn had replaced the roof 3 years ago, and the property taxes were locked in under a senior agricultural exemption. To save the family from carrying this financial anchor, Brenda continued, pressing a hand to her chest. I have decided to liquidate it. I will sell the cabin, quickly clear Mom's imaginary debts, and distribute whatever modest remainder is left according to the will. David frowned slightly. Sell it. Are you sure, Brenda? Mom loved that place. She always said she wanted it to stay in the family. Brenda waved her hand, dismissing him. Emotions do not pay the bills, David. I am making the hard choices. It is the responsible thing to do. As she reached for her champagne flute, her forearm brushed against her linen napkin, knocking it onto the floor. The movement revealed what the cloth had been hiding, a sleek, glossy folder bearing the logo of a high-end commercial real estate firm. The tab on the side was labeled with the cabin's address in fresh, bold ink. I stared at the folder. The logo belonged to a brokerage that specialized in off-market commercial acquisitions, not residential family homes. They bought large tracts of land, bulldozed them, and built luxury resorts. The folder was thick. It contained contracts, not just marketing materials. Brenda had not just decided to sell the cabin this morning. She had engaged a commercial broker, drawn up paperwork, and established a liquidation strategy while Evelyn was still lying in the hospital bed, hooked to a ventilator. The speed of it was chilling. Brenda was attempting to bypass the standard probate process by running a sprint, relying on an outdated 15-year-old will to bluff her way past any immediate scrutiny from David or myself. I already have some feelers out. Brenda lied smoothly, recovering her napkin and casually sliding the real estate folder back into her designer bag, just exploring our options. I took a sip of my ice water. The ice clinked against the glass, sounding remarkably like the rings dropping into Brenda's purse 3 days prior. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not ask questions. I did not challenge her authority. I played the obedient, simple-minded archivist who only cared about yarn. I gave Brenda 0 weapons to use against me. But beneath the surface, my mind was categorizing every lie, every timeline, and every discrepancy. Brenda thought she was orchestrating a seamless robbery. She did not realize I was already mapping the architecture of her collapse. And the very next morning, a single phone call from the mountains would prove exactly how fast the clock was ticking. The basement archives of the Philadelphia Historical Society smell of binding glue and centuries of trapped dust. It is a sterile, controlled environment where the temperature never fluctuates. I spent my Wednesday morning restoring a municipal ledger from the 19th century. My hands moved carefully, smoothing fragile pages with a bone folder. Preservation requires patience. It requires a respect for things that existed long before you arrived. My aunt possessed neither of those qualities. As I worked, my mind kept returning to the country club brunch. I pictured Brenda sliding that yellowed will across the mahogany table. In Pennsylvania, probate does not happen overnight. You cannot simply declare yourself executor and begin liquidating real estate. You have to file the original documents with the Register of Wills, wait for the court to issue letters testamentary, and notify the legal heirs. Brenda was skipping the runway. She was acting as an authority she did not legally hold, yet bluffing her way through the early stages of a sale before my Uncle David or I could ask for a court docket number. She was relying on our grief to keep us compliant. At 10:15, my desk phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar area code from the mountains. I picked up the receiver. It was Thomas Harding. Thomas was a retired forestry professor and my grandmother's closest neighbor in the Poconos. He lived a quarter-mile down the dirt access road and had shared a property line with Evelyn for 4 decades. He was a quiet man who treated the forest with a quiet reverence. "Daisy, you need to come up here," Thomas said. His voice lacked its usual warm rumble. It sounded tight, clipped. I set down my tools and asked him what was wrong. He told me there were trucks parked at the end of Evelyn's driveway. 3 white pickup trucks bearing commercial plates. Men in neon vests were walking the perimeter of the property, carrying surveyor tripods and holding unrolled blueprints. Thomas had walked over to ask what they were doing on private land. The foreman told him they were assessing the old-growth timber for a grading report. "They are tagging the oaks," Thomas told me. "The big ones near the glacial lake, the ones Evelyn planted with your grandfather. You do not tag timber with neon spray paint unless you are planning to clear-cut the lot." My stomach turned over. A standard residential buyer does not measure timber yield. A luxury commercial developer does. A developer who wants to level a historic mid-century cabin, pave over the nutrient-rich soil, and build a boutique resort. Brenda had not just engaged a broker, she had secured a corporate buyer who was already conducting active site inspections. I thanked Thomas for his vigilance and hung up the phone. I pushed the fragile municipal ledger aside. My heart beat against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. The sheer speed of the transaction pointed to one undeniable factor: desperation. Brenda owned a high-end home decor boutique in a trendy downtown neighborhood. She sold imported ceramics and overpriced velvet throw pillows to wealthy housewives. But the retail landscape had shifted dramatically over the past few years, and her commercial lease was astronomical. I had watched her lifestyle outpace her income for a long time. She leased a brand new Mercedes every 2 years. She took luxury vacations to Europe, posting the photos online, while actively dodging calls from domestic creditors. Her credit cards were drowning in compounding interest. She needed an influx of cash, and she needed it before her boutique faced eviction. Evelyn's cabin was not a tax burden to the family. It was a life raft for Brenda alone. She viewed the ancient oaks and the cedar ceilings not as a legacy, but as a source of immediate liquidity. Evelyn was not very good with technology. During the last 5 years of her life, I managed her online accounts. I paid her utility bills, handled her digital subscriptions, and maintained the passwords for her primary email address. I opened a new browser window on my work computer and logged into her account. I typed the real estate brokerage name I had seen on the glossy folder at the country club into the search bar. 3 emails populated the screen. They were sent by Brenda, forwarding correspondence from the broker directly to Evelyn's account under the subject line, Estate Updates. Brenda was sending them to create a fake digital paper trail, attempting to make it look like Evelyn had been aware of the negotiations before she passed away. I clicked on the most recent email. Attached was a preliminary letter of intent from a holding company called Summit Ridge Hospitality. I opened the file. The figures stared back at me in stark black and white. The purchase price was listed at $4.6 million. It was an all-cash offer. The developer was waiving structural inspections. They were waiving the formal appraisal. The most damning detail was buried in the second paragraph. The buyer required an expedited closing timeline of 30 days. 30 days. That was the ticking clock. Brenda planned to use the outdated will to sign the preliminary listing agreements, collect the earnest money deposit, and push the sale through the title company before the estate even formally entered the probate court system. By the time a judge caught up with the paperwork, the cabin would be bulldozed into kindling. The $4.6 million would be wired into a private account, and Brenda would use it to pay off her mounting retail debts, leaving the rest of the family with a hollow apology and an empty piece of land. I printed the letter of intent. The warm paper slid out of the tray holding the exact blueprint of my aunt's greed. The walls were closing in fast. The mundane horror of the situation settled over me. It is terrifying how quickly a lifetime of memories can be converted into a transaction by someone who simply does not care. If I tried to stop her by calling a lawyer today, it would be my word against her 15-year-old document. A court injunction would take weeks to file. I needed something stronger. I needed the real weapon. Evelyn never kept her most valuable possessions in a bank vault or a safety deposit box. She kept them where she could see them. I picked up my cell phone and drafted a text message to Brenda. I told her I was taking her advice. I was driving up to the mountains this weekend to pack up the knitting supplies. The drive up Route 80 from Philadelphia took 2 hours. As the concrete sprawl faded into the dense tree lines of the Poconos Mountains, the air grew thinner and colder. I rolled down the window, letting the scent of damp earth and pine needles fill the cabin of my sedan. This route was carved into my muscle memory. I had made this trip every June of my childhood, escaping the bitter arguments of my parents' divorce, to seek refuge in Evelyn's domain. Today, I was arriving not as a frightened child, but as an archivist sent to retrieve a fabricated prize. My aunt believed I was driving up here to gather old yarn. I was actually driving up here to find the truth. When my tires crunched onto the long gravel driveway, the reality of the situation hit me. The estate sat on 40 acres of old-growth forest, overlooking a pristine glacial lake. The structure itself was an architectural marvel of mid-century design, featuring wide cedar planks and expansive glass windows that mirrored the sky. But the beauty of the landscape was marred by bright neon orange spray paint. Thomas Harding had been right. The commercial developer had already sent surveyors. Bright geometric symbols marked the trunks of the oldest oak trees, designating them for the bulldozers. The sight of that toxic chemical color against the ancient bark made my stomach tighten. Brenda was trading these majestic living monuments for a quick cash payout to cover her retail debts. The clock was ticking louder than ever. I parked near the wraparound stone porch and unlocked the heavy oak door. The interior smelled faintly of beeswax wood smoke and the lavender soap Evelyn always kept by the kitchen sink. The house was dead quiet. Dust motes drifted through the shafts of sunlight pouring through the skylights. I walked past the living room, ignoring the vintage furniture Brenda planned to auction off. I headed straight down the hallway toward the rear study. The study was my grandmother's command center. The focal point of the room was a massive antique desk carved from solid cedar. It had brass handles and a dark polished surface stained by decades of spilled ink and hot tea mugs. I ran my fingers along the beveled edge of the wood, letting a memory surface. I was 16 years old, sitting in the leather armchair across from that very desk. Evelyn was reviewing a contract from a local roofing company, using a brass magnifying glass to read the bottom paragraphs. She looked over the rim of her reading glasses and tapped the paper with her index finger. "Daisy," she told me, "you must always read the fine print. The big bold letters at the top are designed to sell you a dream. The tiny letters at the bottom dictate the reality." I had asked her why she was so paranoid about a simple roof repair. She set the magnifying glass down and looked out the window toward the lake. Her expression hardened into a rare display of sorrow. "Because I raised a daughter who does not value history," Evelyn had murmured, referring to Brenda. "Your aunt measures worth in currency. She only loves things with price tags. When I'm gone, Brenda will try to liquidate every memory in this house. You must be prepared to stop her." Evelyn was not a woman who left her legacy to chance. She knew exactly what Brenda would attempt the moment her heart stopped beating. She also knew that a bank vault was the first place a greedy relative would look. I walked around to the back of the cedar desk. Evelyn had shown me the secret compartment, once swearing me to secrecy. It was an old-world piece of furniture crafted by an artisan who understood the value of hidden spaces. I knelt on the woven rug and pulled out the bottom right drawer, placing it gently on the floor. I reached my arm into the dark, empty cavity, feeling along the interior wooden panel. My fingertips found a small metal latch recessed into the grain. I pressed upward. A quiet click echoed in the silent room. The false floor of the desk cavity dropped an inch. I slid my hand inside and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with red wax. The emblem of a law firm was stamped into the wax. It was not the yellowed, brittle paper Brenda had presented at the country club. This envelope was crisp, pristine, and entirely modern. I sat back on my heels and cracked the seal. I pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on high-quality watermarked paper. I turned to the first page. The header read, "The Evelyn Campbell Irrevocable Living Trust." I checked the execution date at the bottom of the page. It was signed and notarized a mere 6 months ago. The signatures were sharp and deliberate. Evelyn had drafted a brand new estate plan right after her terminal diagnosis, rendering Brenda's 15-year-old last will and testament entirely void. I sat on the floor of the study and read the fine print reading exactly as Evelyn had taught me. The legal architecture was flawless. The trust transferred ownership of the Poconos cabin, the 40 acres of timber, and the glacial lake access out of Evelyn's personal estate and directly into the protective vehicle of the trust. Brenda had no legal authority over these assets because they no longer belonged to Evelyn. They belonged to the entity created by the paperwork. I turned to page 7, identifying the successor trustee. My own name stared back at me. Daisy Campbell, sole trustee and sole beneficiary. I was the only person on earth with the legal authority to sign a deed transfer for this property. But Evelyn had gone one step further. She knew that sudden wealth could corrupt anyone, even me. She wanted to ensure the forest remained standing long after we were both gone. I turned to page 9 and found the armor she had forged. It was labeled Restrictive Covenant and Deed Restriction. The paragraph was a legally binding no-sale clause. It explicitly stated that the property could not be subdivided, commercialized, or sold to any corporate development entity for a period of 50 years. The land could only be transferred to a biological heir or a recognized state conservation organization. If a trustee attempted to violate this clause, the ownership of the property would instantly forfeit to the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation. Evelyn had built an ironclad fortress out of paper. The luxury developer surveying the trees outside was wasting their time. Their $4.6 million cash offer was legally impossible to execute. I sat in the quiet study holding a live grenade. The power dynamic of my entire family had just inverted. I had the legal authority to march down the driveway, order the surveyors off my land, and call Brenda to tell her the game was over. I could hear her screams of frustration in my mind. But I did not reach for my phone. I did not send a text. Shouting matches only provide abusers with an opportunity to twist the narrative and play the victim. If I confronted Brenda now, she would simply hire a sleazy lawyer and attempt to drag me into a protracted probate battle. I needed her to step so far into her own trap that she could not walk back out. I placed the original trust documents back into the heavy envelope. I walked into the living room and grabbed a cardboard box, filling it with Evelyn's old knitting needles and a few skeins of wool to maintain my cover story. I locked the front door of the cabin, ignoring the neon spray paint on the trees as I walked to my car. I drove 10 miles into the nearest mountain town and parked in front of a small independent shipping store. I paid the clerk a few dollars to use their industrial copy machine. I made a pristine, flawless duplicate of the irrevocable trust, placing the copies into a plain manila folder. I sealed the original envelope inside my canvas tote bag. As I drove back toward Philadelphia, my mind shifted from defense to offense. I had the weapon to stop the sale. But the developer had already transferred $250,000 in earnest money to secure the 30-day closing window. A sudden, unsettling realization washed over me. If Brenda was legally incapable of selling the house, how exactly had she intercepted that massive deposit, and what was she currently doing with the cash? The answer would reveal a crime far worse than simple greed. The canvas tote bag sat on the passenger seat of my sedan the entire drive back to Philadelphia. Inside, the heavy red wax envelope felt like an anchor. I had the shield to protect the Poconos property, but a glaring financial discrepancy kept cycling through my mind. In commercial real estate, a buyer does not simply sign a letter of intent and wait 30 days. They secure the property by placing earnest money into an escrow account. For a $4 million cash offer, the standard deposit would be at least $250,000. If Brenda was legally incapable of opening an estate bank account without court approval, where exactly did that money go? The answer arrived the following Tuesday, via a hesitant phone call from Richard Sterling. Richard was a certified public accountant who had managed Evelyn's tax returns since the late 90s. He was a creature of habit. He wore muted gray suits, kept his desk impeccably organized, and possessed a nervous stomach that flared up whenever numbers failed to align. Evelyn trusted him because he was boring. Brenda despised him for the exact same reason. Richard asked me to meet him at a diner 3 blocks from his accounting firm. When I slid into the vinyl booth, he was already nursing a black coffee. He looked pale. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the Formica tabletop. He pushed a manila folder across the table, keeping his hand flat on the cover. "Daisy," he began, his voice barely rising above the diner ambient noise. "I am technically breaching client confidentiality by speaking with you. But your grandmother was my friend, and what your aunt is doing crosses a line I cannot ignore." I opened the folder. Inside was a printed confirmation of a wire transfer. The document originated from Summit Ridge Hospitality, the commercial developer targeting the cabin. The transaction amount was exactly $250,000. The line detailing the receiving account did not list the Campbell estate. It did not list a Pennsylvania probate registry. The recipient was listed as Sun Coast Title, an escrow located in Boca Raton, Florida. I traced the routing numbers with my index finger. Richard, why is a commercial developer in Pennsylvania sending $250,000 to a title company in Florida? Richard lowered his voice, taking a cautious sip of his coffee, because Brenda instructed them to route the earnest money directly toward her personal purchase. She is buying a luxury condominium in a high-rise overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The purchase price is $1.2 million. That wire transfer was her non-refundable deposit to secure the Florida contract. The sheer audacity of the maneuver forced me to sit back against the vinyl booth. Embezzlement is a quiet crime usually committed through slow, incremental skimming. Brenda had bypassed the skimming phase entirely. She had taken a sledgehammer to the estate before Evelyn's death certificate was even officially registered. "Let me trace the logic," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Brenda used the outdated will to convince the commercial developer she was the sole executor. She signed the preliminary sale agreement for the cabin. Instead of placing their earnest money into a secure estate account, she directed the developer to wire the funds straight into the escrow account of a completely unrelated Florida real estate transaction. Richard nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "She is bridging the 2 deals, Daisy. She timed the closing dates back to back. She expects the Poconos cabin to close on the 15th of next month. The developer will pay the remaining balance in cash. Brenda plans to take her alleged executor fee, pay off her boutique debts, and then close on the Boca Raton condo the very next morning. She is using the developer's deposit to hold her spot, assuming the final sale will wash the money clean before a judge ever sees the probate ledger." A waitress walked by, refilling our coffee mugs. I waited until she was out of earshot before speaking again. "Richard, I said you understand this is not just greedy. Crossing state lines with misappropriated funds changes the jurisdiction. This is a federal offense." He swallowed hard. "It is textbook wire fraud, Daisy. And it is embezzlement. If the Poconos sale falls through for any reason, Brenda is trapped. The Florida contract stipulates that the $250,000 deposit is hard money, meaning it is non-refundable. If she fails to produce the remaining $950,000 on closing day, the seller keeps the deposit. She will have stolen $250,000 from a commercial developer and lost it to a Florida real estate broker. The liability would ruin her." I looked at the wire transfer receipt again. Brenda had built her entire future on a foundation of stolen money. She was driving toward a cliff, blindfolded by her own entitlement. I thanked Richard for his courage. I promised him I would handle the situation without exposing his involvement. I left the diner and walked back to the Historical Society, the chill of the autumn wind biting through my coat. My mind was a calculating machine. The dynamic of the looming confrontation had shifted. I was no longer just protecting a forest. I was preparing to watch a federal crime detonate in my aunt's face. When I sat down at my desk, I opened my personal phone. I navigated to a social media application and typed Brenda's name into the search bar. I rarely checked her profile, but today required a specific kind of verification. Her page was a curated exhibition of unearned wealth. She posted daily updates designed to make her followers envious. Her most recent upload was posted only 2 hours ago. The image featured a sprawling balcony with a glass railing. Beyond the railing, the turquoise waters of the Atlantic Ocean stretched toward the horizon. A pair of expensive sunglasses rested on a teak patio table next to a crystal flute of sparkling wine. The caption underneath the photo read, "Blessed New Beginnings. The universe always provides for those who are brave enough to chase their dreams." Next chapter. Boca Raton. She had even tagged the luxury high-rise building in the location marker. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, detached sense of clarity. Arrogance is the loudest form of stupidity. Brenda was publicly broadcasting the fruits of her embezzlement, leaving a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to her fraud. She believed she was untouchable because she had spent her entire life bulldozing over the quiet members of our family without consequence. She assumed my Uncle David would remain passive. She assumed Liam would stay distracted by his phone. And she assumed I was just a mousy archivist who cared more about old knitting yarn than financial ledgers. She was relying on the 30-day closing window to hide the theft. The speed of the transaction was her only shield. If the developer acquired the cabin, they would bulldoze the trees and walk away happy. Brenda would get her condo. The estate would be drained and the crime would be buried under the guise of an expedited family liquidation. I closed the application and locked my phone screen. The screen faded to black, reflecting my own steady gaze. Evelyn's irrevocable trust was currently resting inside the canvas tote bag at my feet. The document contained the 50-year no-sale clause. It was the brick wall Brenda was speeding toward. If I showed the trust to Brenda right now, she would panic. She would cancel the Florida contract, try to return the stolen deposit, and hire a defense attorney to untangle the mess. She would escape with a few bruised egos and a fractured credit score. She would learn nothing. She would survive to steal another day. I remembered my grandmother's voice in the quiet cedar study. You must be prepared to stop her. Stopping her early was a mercy she did not deserve. To truly honor Evelyn's legacy, I had to let Brenda reach the closing table. I had to let her sign the paperwork in front of the commercial developers and the title officers. I had to let the reality of the non-refundable Florida deposit lock her in a trap of her own making. The stage was set, the money was wired. The only thing left to do was find a legal architect who could help me spring the trap with lethal precision. The law offices of Thorne & Associates occupied the 14th floor of a glass building overlooking Center City, Philadelphia. The reception area lacked decorative plants or soothing artwork. It was designed for strict efficiency. The carpet was a muted charcoal, and the lighting felt intentionally clinical. I carried my canvas tote bag to the front desk. The receptionist did not ask my name. She simply nodded toward a heavy oak door at the end of the hallway. I walked past a row of silent conference rooms. My footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet. I was entering a space where emotions were treated as structural flaws and logic reigned supreme. Marcus Thorne was a man who embodied his profession. He wore a navy suit tailored to severe angles and kept his desk devoid of clutter. He did not possess the warm, reassuring demeanor of a grief counselor. He was a tactician. Evelyn had hired him 6 months ago for that exact reason. She knew her family dynamics required a shark rather than a friend. When I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, he did not offer hollow condolences regarding my grandmother. He offered a yellow legal pad and a silver pen, pushing them across the polished mahogany surface. I reached into my canvas bag and withdrew the plain manila folder containing the photocopied trust. I placed it squarely on his blotter. Beside it, I laid the wire transfer receipt Richard Sterling had provided. Marcus picked up the trust first. His eyes scanned the crisp pages, verifying his own handiwork. He checked the notarized seals and the execution dates. He then picked up the wire receipt. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed a slight tightening in his jaw. The pieces of the puzzle were locking into place. Your grandmother was remarkably prescient. Marcus said, his voice an even steady baritone. She anticipated a hostile liquidation of her assets. This trust supersedes any previous testamentary documents, including the 15-year-old will your aunt is currently waving around. It possesses undeniable legal supremacy. A trust does not require a probate judge to validate it. The property is currently owned by the trust entity, not the deceased individual. Therefore, Brenda possesses zero legal authority to list the Poconos property, let alone accept a $250,000 earnest money deposit on its behalf. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees. I want to stop the commercial sale, Marcus. I want to protect the ancient timber in the cabin. But I also want Brenda to face the reality of what she has done. If I walk up to her today and serve her with a cease and desist notice, what exactly happens? Marcus uncapped his silver pen. He drew a vertical line down the center of the yellow legal pad. On the left side, he wrote the word today. On the right side, he wrote the word closing. If we intervene today, Marcus explained, tapping the left column with the tip of his pen, Brenda will simply claim ignorance. She will state she honestly believed the outdated will was the controlling document. She will cancel the commercial sale return, the developer's deposit, and withdraw from the Florida condominium contract, citing an unforeseen delay in the probate process. She might lose a few $1,000s in administrative penalties or broker fees, but she will walk away legally intact. She will survive to manipulate your family another day. He moved his pen to the right column. But if we allow her to proceed to the title company closing table, the architecture of her liability changes fundamentally. Real estate transactions rely heavily on title insurance. The commercial developer is wiring that $250,000 based on a fraudulent premise. The title officer is the ultimate barrier against fraud because their insurance company indemnifies the buyer. If the title is clouded by a secret trust, the policy cannot be issued. Without the policy, the funds cannot be dispersed. By the time Brenda sits in that room and attempts to sign the final deed transfer, she will cross a legal threshold she cannot uncross. Marcus wrote the words, fiduciary breach, on the pad. Brenda is acting as a false executor. She directed corporate funds across state lines into a personal escrow account. That Florida deposit is categorized as hard money. It is non-refundable because the contingencies have been waived to secure the luxury property. If the Poconos deal fails at the closing table, Brenda cannot refund the developer because the Florida seller will seize the escrow funds due to a breach of contract. I watched the dark ink dry on the yellow paper. Marcus was spelling out a financial execution. Justice in his office was not loud, it was methodical. It was built on rigid statutes and strict liability. He was handing me a blueprint for ruin. He looked up from the pad, his dark eyes locking onto mine. If you want to protect the land, you can do it today, Marcus said softly. If you want to ensure your aunt never attempts to defraud your family again, you must wait. You must let her sit at the head of that conference table believing she has won. You must let the closing attorney review the fraudulent deed. You must let the trap snap shut when it is too late for her to pull her hand back. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over my shoulders. The anxiety of the ticking clock evaporated into the sterile air of the office. The countdown was no longer a threat hanging over my head. It was a weapon resting in my palm. I am an archivist. I know how to preserve valuable things. I would preserve Evelyn's legacy by letting Brenda destroy her own. We agreed on the strategy in quiet, measured tones. Marcus would contact the title company handling the developer transaction later that afternoon. He would place a quiet flag on the property file, ensuring the transaction could not legally clear underwriting, but he would allow the closing date to remain scheduled. The commercial developer would show up expecting the keys. Brenda would show up expecting a wire transfer. My job was far more difficult. I had to return to my family and continue playing the invisible obedient niece. I had to swallow every insult and agree with every lie. I had to watch Brenda parade around as the savior of the estate without breaking character for a single second. Brenda expected submission. She expected me to fade into the background while the grown-ups handled the business. I would use my sensible shoes and my quiet demeanor as camouflage. The tension inside me had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer worried about whether I could stop my aunt. I was contemplating exactly how devastating the impact would be when the illusion finally shattered. I stood up and shook his hand. The leather of his briefcase matched the leather of his chair. Everything in his world was calculated and precise. I walked out of the glass building and stepped into the crisp autumn wind blowing off the Schuylkill River. I retrieved my cell phone from my coat pocket. The screen illuminated with a new notification. Brenda had sent a group message inviting the immediate family to a memorial dinner at an upscale seafood restaurant downtown. She promised to pay for everything, using the estate accounts, of course. She claimed it was time to celebrate Evelyn's beautiful journey and look toward the future. I smiled a cold, empty smile. I typed a polite, agreeable reply and prepared to watch a thief spend money she was about to permanently lose. The private dining room at Oceanair Seafood Room was draped in heavy velvet curtains and illuminated by oversized crystal chandeliers. It was an environment engineered for celebrating corporate acquisitions and milestone anniversaries, not for observing the solemn remembrance of a grandmother. Brenda had reserved the entire back section of the establishment. She justified the exorbitant cost by labeling the gathering a celebration of life. I knew the actual truth. She was throwing a lavish party funded by the imaginary security of her Florida escrow account. She was spending capital she technically had not even secured yet, riding the euphoric high of her own perceived brilliance. When I walked through the double mahogany doors, I spotted Brenda immediately. She held court near the private marble bar, wearing a striking black designer dress. The garment featured a conservative neckline but a sharp silhouette. The silk fabric looked prohibitively expensive. She held a crystal flute of champagne in her right hand and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a white linen napkin in her left. The extended family was scattered around the spacious room. Aunts and second cousins who only materialized during weddings and funerals stood in small, tight clusters murmuring sympathetic platitudes. Uncle David sat in a corner leather booth, nursing a neat glass of scotch, looking significantly more diminished than he had at the country club brunch. Cousin Liam stood by the raw oyster bar complaining loudly to a waiter about the slow speed of the restaurant wireless network. I found my designated seat at the long banquet table. A menu printed on thick, textured cardstock rested squarely on my porcelain plate. The culinary offerings included prime Wagyu beef and wild-caught king salmon. Brenda spared no expense whenever she believed she was playing with someone else's money. Halfway through the evening service, Brenda tapped her crystal glass with a heavy silver fork. The sharp ringing sound demanded total silence from the room. The ambient chatter ceased immediately. Waiters paused mid-stride, holding heavy silver trays of roasted asparagus and truffle mashed potatoes. Brenda stood at the head of the long table. She took a slow, deep breath, closing her eyes for a brief theatrical moment. When she opened them, she allowed a single perfectly timed tear to escape and roll down her cheek. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight." Brenda began, her voice trembling with a manufactured layer of sorrow. Mom meant the entire world to every single person in this room. Losing her has left a profound void in our hearts that we can never truly fill. She paused, allowing a soft murmur of collective agreement to ripple through the captive audience. Managing her estate has taken an unimaginable emotional toll on my spirit. Brenda continued, pressing a manicured hand against her collarbone, going through her personal items, reviewing her final wishes, sorting out her endless piles of complicated paperwork. "It is thoroughly exhausting, but I am the eldest child. It is my fundamental duty to bear this heavy burden so the rest of you can simply grieve in peace without the stress of logistics." It was a masterful psychological manipulation. She was actively painting herself as a selfless martyr, sacrificing her own physical well-being for the collective good of the bloodline. Anyone who dared to question her administrative decisions would instantly look ungrateful and remarkably cruel. She was locking in her false narrative in a highly public setting, weaponizing the collective emotion of the dining room to shield her impending financial crimes. Brenda stepped away from her chair and walked slowly down the length of the banquet table. She stopped right behind my seat. She placed a heavy, patronizing hand firmly on my left shoulder. Her expensive imported perfume enveloped me entirely, suffocating the savory scent of the roasted seafood on my plate. "And then there is our precious Daisy," Brenda announced, squeezing my shoulder tightly to ensure everyone was looking at us. We all know how much time she spent with Mom during those quiet summer months. Daisy is so brave, but she is very simple. She lives a quiet, isolated life, sorting her little historical papers in a basement. She does not understand the harsh complexities of modern finance or severe legal liabilities. That is exactly why I am stepping up to protect her. I want to make sure our sweet Daisy is permanently shielded from the ugly realities of the adult world. A few older relatives offered me sympathetic, condescending smiles from across the table. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not flinch away from her suffocating grip. I looked down at my plate, picking up my silver fork. I sliced a small piece of my wild-caught salmon. "Thank you, Aunt Brenda," I said, maintaining a mild, agreeable tone. "I appreciate everything you are doing to handle the complicated business matters." Brenda beamed, her enormous ego swelling visibly. She patted my shoulder one last time before returning to her command post at the head of the room. She raised her champagne flute high, preparing to deliver the final act of her dramatic performance. "Because I must protect this family from financial ruin, I have had to make a heartbreaking choice," Brenda declared, letting her voice drop to a somber, dramatic whisper. "Mom unfortunately left behind a mountain of hidden liabilities. Staggering medical debt, extreme structural repair costs, unpaid back taxes. To save us all from a protracted bankruptcy, I have arranged to sell the Poconos property." A collective gasp echoed through the private dining room. Uncle David looked up from his scotch, his brow furrowed in genuine distress and confusion. "Sell the cabin?" David asked, his voice breaking slightly under the emotional weight. "But the forest, the glacial lake. That land has been in our family for multiple generations, Brenda." "It is a necessary tragedy," Brenda snapped, abandoning her soft sorrow for a sudden flash of cold, unquestionable authority. "I did not want to do this. But the cabin is a financial anchor dragging us all underwater. I found a corporate buyer willing to pay cash and close quickly. They will clear the debts and spare us a protracted nightmare. It is already in motion. We must let go of the past to secure our future." I chewed my salmon slowly. It was cooked perfectly, flaky and rich. I swallowed, taking a sip of sparkling water. I was mentally cataloging every single syllable exiting my aunt's mouth. She was lying directly to her brother. She was lying to her cousins. She was weaving a tapestry of deceit so dense she was actually beginning to believe it herself. She used the phrase "necessary tragedy" to describe a commercial liquidation that would personally fund her luxury condominium in Boca Raton. She cited imaginary medical debts while actively embezzling $250,000 in developer earnest money. She called me simple while I sat quietly holding the irrevocable legal instrument that would orchestrate her total financial destruction. Abusers love a captive audience. They deeply crave witnesses to validate their alternate reality. Brenda thought she was presenting a flawless stage play. She had no idea she was delivering a taped confession. Every lie she spoke tonight would soon become a jagged piece of evidence during her eventual federal indictment. The dinner continued without further disruption. The main plates were cleared and decadent chocolate desserts were served alongside espresso. Relatives approached Brenda one by one to offer their deep gratitude, praising her incredible strength and her sharp business acumen. She soaked up the adulation like a dry sponge. I ate my rich dessert, listening to the clinking of expensive silverware against fine china. As the evening finally wound down, Brenda intercepted me near the front coat check. She looked flushed, triumphant, and radiating arrogance. "I am bringing the commercial developer up to the mountains on Thursday morning," Brenda instructed me, handing her valet ticket to the attendant. "They need to do a final physical walkthrough before the official closing next week. I want you at the cabin bright and early, Daisy. You need to clear out the rest of those old knitting supplies and whatever junk you want to keep. The new owners are bringing in heavy demolition equipment by the end of the month. I will not tolerate any delays in the schedule." I looked at her flushed, confident face. She was so secure in her victory, she was literally inviting me to watch the enemy survey the spoils of war. She wanted me there as a silent prop, a defeated witness to her supreme authority. "I will be there, Aunt Brenda," I replied, pulling my heavy wool coat over my shoulders. "I will make sure everything is cleared out for you." "Good girl," Brenda said, turning on her heel and walking toward the valet stand without looking back. I watched her glide through the revolving glass doors and step into the cool night air. The trap was fully set. The legal architecture was locked into place by Marcus Thorne. The embezzled funds were resting safely in the Florida escrow account. The extended family was thoroughly convinced of her false narrative. The only thing left was the physical walkthrough. She wanted to stand on the wraparound stone porch and sell a historic forest she did not own to a luxury developer who was walking straight into an invisible snare. The quiet archivist would be there taking detailed notes, waiting for the exact moment the ancient timber would fight back. The air in the Pocono Mountains on Thursday morning was crisp and tasted of damp pine. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of ancient oak trees, casting long geometric shadows across the wraparound stone porch. I arrived at Evelyn's cabin shortly after dawn. My task was to catalog the genuine antiques remaining in the estate. As a professional archivist, I approached the job with rigorous methodology. I brought heavy cardboard boxes, acid-free tissue paper, and a thick canvas binding ledger. I stood in the center of the living room, carefully wrapping a delicate stained glass lamp. The silence of the forest was a heavy, comforting blanket. It was a silence that demanded respect. At precisely 9 o'clock, the tranquility shattered. The aggressive crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of the enemy. I walked to the expansive front window and looked out. A pristine, silver Mercedes sport utility vehicle parked near the base of the wooden steps. The luxury car looked entirely absurd against the rugged backdrop of the wilderness. The driver's side door opened, and Brenda stepped out. She wore knee-high suede boots and a tailored cashmere coat. It was an outfit curated for a metropolitan shopping district, not a mountain property. Two men emerged from the passenger doors. The first man wore a sharp charcoal suit and polished leather shoes. He carried a sleek electronic tablet. He carried himself with the distinct, unhurried confidence of a corporate executive. The second man was dressed in reinforced denim work boots and a bright neon safety vest. He carried a rolled set of architectural blueprints and a laser measuring device. They walked up the stone steps. Brenda did not bother to knock. She pushed the heavy oak door open and marched into the living room, acting as though she had held the deed for a decade. "Daisy, you are still here," Brenda announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted cedar ceiling. "I told you to start packing early." I placed the wrapped stained glass lamp into a sturdy box. "I am making good progress, Aunt Brenda," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Brenda waved a dismissive hand in my direction, turning her attention immediately to the man in the charcoal suit. "Gentlemen, this is my niece Daisy. She is just gathering some old sentimental knitting yarn before we clear the structure. Daisy, this is Greg Harrison. He represents Summit Ridge Hospitality. They are the buyers, and this is his demolition foreman." Greg Harrison offered me a brief, practiced nod. He did not extend his hand. To him, I was merely a temporary obstacle occupying a space his company intended to erase. He tapped the screen of his electronic tablet, bringing up a digital map of the 40-acre lot. "The footprint of the house is relatively small," Greg noted, pacing the length of the living room. "We will need to tear up the foundation completely to accommodate the underground parking structure for the boutique resort. The grading on the western slope is steep. We will have to level it." The foreman unrolled his blueprints on my grandmother's antique dining table. He pointed a thick finger toward the front window. "The main issue is the access road. It is too narrow for commercial construction vehicles. We cannot get the heavy excavators up here without widening the path by at least 20 feet on both sides." Greg looked out the window, assessing the landscape. "That means the old growth timber near the driveway has to go. All of it." My chest tightened. They were talking about the majestic oaks Evelyn had planted with my grandfather. Trees that had survived brutal winters and severe storms for half a century. They were standing in my living room, casual planning the execution of a living forest. Clear it all out, Brenda agreed enthusiastically, her eyes shining with the prospect of an expedited payout. The trees are a nuisance anyway. They drop leaves all over the roof and block the natural light. Bring in whatever machinery you need. I want a clean slate for your resort. Brenda walked over to the stone fireplace, running a manicured finger along the mantel. She treated the cabin like a discarded theatrical set. She pointed out walls to smash and fixtures to throw into a dumpster. She spoke about the property as if it were already reduced to rubble and ash. Then she turned her sharp gaze back to me. Listen to me carefully, Daisy, Brenda instructed, crossing her arms over her cashmere coat. I want every single box of junk out of here by the 15th of the month. The closing is scheduled for that afternoon in Philadelphia. Greg is bringing his demolition crews up here on the morning of the 16th. I will not have you holding up a multi-million-dollar commercial project because you cannot pack a few sweaters fast enough. The condescension in her voice was thick and deliberate. She was performing for the corporate executives, demonstrating her absolute authority over the estate and her family. She wanted them to view her as a ruthless businesswoman. She wanted me to cower. I felt my blood heat up. A sudden fierce urge to reach into my canvas tote bag, retrieve the irrevocable trust, and slap the legal document against Greg Harrison's chest washed over me. I wanted to watch their smug faces contort in horror as they realized the 50-year restrictive covenant made their luxury resort a legal impossibility. But I remembered the meticulous advice of Marcus Thorne. A trap only works if the prey walks all the way inside. I lowered my eyes, projecting total submission. I understand, Aunt Brenda, I said quietly. I will have everything cleared out well before the 15th. You will not have to worry about me. Brenda smiled a cold, triumphant smirk. Perfect, she purred. Her cell phone vibrated inside her leather handbag. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A look of frantic excitement flashed across her features. Excuse me, gentlemen, she said, holding a finger up. I need to take this. It is my realtor in Florida confirming the escrow receipt for my new condominium. Brenda practically sprinted out the front door, stepping onto the porch to take the call. The foreman rolled up his blueprints and walked into the kitchen to inspect the load-bearing walls. I was left alone in the living room with Greg Harrison. The developer tucked his electronic tablet under his arm. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, tracing the intricate joinery of the cedar beams. He ran a hand along the smooth stone of the fireplace. For a brief, fleeting second, the corporate mask slipped, revealing a genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship surrounding him. It really is a shame, he murmured, speaking more to himself than to me. The architecture here is extraordinary. You do not see builders use joinery like this anymore. It is built to last 100 years. I picked up a roll of packing tape. It is a historic property, I replied, my voice calm and steady. My grandmother loved every inch of this wood. Greg sighed, a hollow corporate sound. He adjusted his expensive silk tie. Well, cash is cash, he stated, dismissing his brief moment of appreciation. The market dictates the highest and best use of the land. A single-family cabin does not generate revenue. A boutique resort does. It is nothing personal, just business. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite smile. I let the silence stretch between us until the atmosphere grew thick and uncomfortable. Just business, I echoed softly. Well, Mr. Harrison, since you are investing such a significant amount of cash, I assume your legal team is thorough. He frowned, slightly confused by the sudden shift in my tone. We use the best corporate attorneys in the state, he replied defensively. Why do you ask? I picked up a heavy cardboard box, resting it against my hip. I walked past him, heading toward the hallway. Make sure you check the title thoroughly, I said, tossing the words over my shoulder like a discarded wrapper. Greg let out a short, arrogant chuckle. He assumed I was a bitter, grieving relative, grasping at imaginary legal straws to save a childhood memory. The subtle hint sailed right over his head, bouncing off the thick armor of his corporate ego. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He simply shook his head and walked into the kitchen to join his foreman. 10 minutes later, Brenda finished her phone call. She gathered her guests, herding them toward the front door. She did not say goodbye to me. She walked down the stone steps, her stilettos clicking sharply against the rock. I watched through the front window as she climbed into the driver's seat of her leased silver Mercedes. She started the engine and reversed down the gravel driveway, leaving a cloud of gray dust floating in the mountain air. She drove away feeling like a conquering queen, entirely confident that she had secured her Florida paradise and outsmarted her entire family. I stood in the quiet cabin surrounded by ancient wood and unbreakable glass. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and marked the 15th of the month on my digital calendar. The walkthrough was over. The physical invasion was complete. The next time I saw Brenda and Greg Harrison, we would not be standing in a forest. We would be sitting in a sterile conference room in Philadelphia, waiting for a title officer to detonate a bomb they never saw coming. The law offices of Thorne and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a modern high-rise overlooking the gray waters of the Schuylkill River. The reception area was entirely devoid of decorative plants or soothing artwork. It was a space engineered for strict administrative efficiency. The carpets were a muted charcoal, and the ambient lighting felt intentionally clinical. I carried my canvas tote bag past the front desk, walking down a hallway lined with silent mahogany doors. My footsteps made zero sound on the thick floor covering. I was entering a sanctuary where erratic emotions were treated as structural flaws and calculated logic reigned supreme. Marcus Thorne was an attorney who perfectly mirrored his profession. He wore a severe navy suit tailored to rigid angles, keeping his workspace aggressively pristine. He did not possess the warm, reassuring demeanor typically associated with grief counselors or family advisors. He was a legal tactician. Marcus had spent the first decade of his career as a corporate litigator unraveling complex financial conspiracies before shifting his expertise into estate law. He preferred the silent, unyielding world of trusts because paper never altered its narrative under pressure. He appreciated the invisible mechanics of a flawless ambush. Evelyn had hired him 6 months ago for that precise reason. She knew her family dynamics required a predator rather than a peacemaker. I sat across from him in a heavy leather chair, listening to the rhythmic hum of a laser printer resting in the corner of the room. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week before the scheduled commercial settlement. Marcus retrieved a stack of freshly generated documents, pulling them from the output tray and placing them squarely on his blotter. In the United States, transferring commercial real estate is never a simple exchange of cash for keys. It is a highly regulated mitigation of liability. When a massive developer like Summit Ridge Hospitality purchases a property, they do not rely on a casual handshake or a confident smile. They rely entirely on title insurance. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He explained the invisible architecture of the trap we were building. An escrow officer functions as the ultimate brick wall against property fraud. Their singular duty is to trace the chain of ownership backward through decades of public records, ensuring there are no hidden liens, unrecorded easements, or secret heirs. If an underwriting firm issues an insurance policy, they are financially guaranteeing that the corporate buyer is receiving a clean, undisputed deed. If the agency misses a fraudulent claim, the insurance corporation pays the massive penalty. Therefore, settlement officers do not take risks. They do not care about your emotional sob story or your desperate expedited timeline. They only care about the rigid legal sequence of the paperwork. Marcus picked up his desk phone, dialing the direct extension for Commonwealth Land and Title. This was the specific agency handling the developer acquisition. He asked for the senior underwriter assigned to the Poconos property file. When the woman answered, Marcus did not raise his voice. He spoke with the casual precision of a surgeon requesting a specialized scalpel. He informed the underwriter that his firm represented the Daisy Campbell Irrevocable Living Trust. He notified her that this specific trust held the exclusive legal deed to the mountain cabin, rendering any prior testamentary documents completely invalid. He did not yell or threaten hostile litigation. He simply provided a certified trust identification number and gently suggested she review the updated county recording ledger. The underwriter immediately placed a quiet administrative flag on the transaction file. I watched Marcus disconnect the call. I asked him if the settlement office would cancel the upcoming meeting, now that they knew a severe conflict existed on the record. Marcus shook his head, sliding a silver pen across the polished desk toward me. They will never cancel the meeting, he explained, his dark eyes completely calm. Underwriting firms strongly prefer to resolve ownership clouds with all relevant parties physically present in the room. They will leave the appointment active on the calendar. They will allow the commercial developers to arrive with their final cashier checks. They will allow your aunt to arrive expecting a massive wire transfer. The settlement officer will wait until everyone is seated around the table before demanding an explanation for the conflicting trust document. It is the most efficient method to clear a contested title. We are simply letting the institutional system do the heavy lifting for us. I picked up the silver pen. The metal barrel felt heavy and cold against my fingers. Marcus tapped the signature line on the document resting directly in front of me. It was the formal acceptance of trustee appointment. By signing my name, I was legally assuming absolute control over the estate. I was stepping out from the shadows, embracing my rightful position as the permanent guardian of the forest. I thought about Brenda standing on the wraparound stone porch, pointing at the majestic oaks and demanding they be bulldozed into kindling. I thought about the stolen $250,000 deposit currently resting in a Florida escrow account, securing a luxury condominium my aunt had zero legal right to occupy. I pressed the fine tip of the pen against the crisp white paper. I signed my name using slow, deliberate strokes. The printer in the corner hummed quietly again, generating the final confirmation copies. There were no dramatic screaming matches occurring in this office. There were no theatrical tears or aggressive physical altercations. We were orchestrating a woman's total financial destruction utilizing nothing more than black ink and procedural rules. True justice does not require a loud captive audience. It only requires the objective truth to be filed in the correct administrative sequence. Have you ever sat quietly while someone dug their own grave? Type shovel in the comments below. I handed the executed document back to Marcus. He placed it inside a thick manila folder, sealing the brass clasp with absolute finality. The mechanical snare was officially set and armed. Brenda was currently spending her afternoons shopping for expensive coastal furniture, completely oblivious to the massive legal wall rapidly rising directly in her path. She genuinely believed her greatest obstacle was waiting for her simple niece to pack away some old knitting yarn. She had spent her entire adult life bulldozing over the quiet members of our family without facing a single consequence. She assumed my Uncle David would remain entirely passive regarding the liquidation. She assumed my cousin Liam would stay distracted by his digital screens. She assumed I was just a mousy archivist who lacked the courage to challenge her supreme authority. Her immense arrogance had blinded her to the basic defensive mechanics of estate law, but the architecture of her deception was highly unstable. When a person attempts to build a financial house of cards across multiple state lines, the absolute slightest breeze can cause a catastrophic structural collapse. The developer settlement was only 7 days away, but Brenda was balancing 2 massive real estate transactions on a single fraudulent pivot point. The Florida seller was not going to wait patiently while Brenda played games with the estate timeline. They were going to demand comprehensive proof of funds for the remaining $950,000 balance well before they allowed her to finalize her coastal purchase. Brenda had completely ignored the rigid funding contingencies written into her southern contract. The first domino was about to wobble severely, and the ensuing panic would strike long before we ever stepped foot inside the title company conference room. The polished facade of my aunt's grand illusion began to fracture exactly 3 days before the scheduled commercial settlement. The incident occurred on a rainy Monday morning inside Evelyn's primary residence, a narrow brick townhouse located in the historic district of Philadelphia. Brenda had commandeered the formal dining room, transforming the space into her personal estate management headquarters. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by stacks of unpaid utility bills and glossy brochures for interior decorators in South Florida. I was kneeling on the hardwood floor nearby, wrapping my grandmother's vintage silver flatware in protective felt cloths. I played my role to perfection, remaining entirely invisible while executing my assigned manual labor. At 10:15, the sharp ringing of a cellular phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the townhouse. The caller identification displayed a recognizable southern area code. Brenda snatched the device from the table, answering with her signature performative warmth. She greeted her Florida real estate broker using a bright, breezy tone. She asked about the weather in Boca Raton and discussed her plans for renovating the kitchen island in her new coastal condominium. But the cheerful cadence of the conversation did not last. The broker was not calling to exchange pleasantries. He was calling to enforce the rigid stipulations of a luxury property contract. I kept my head down, focusing on a silver serving spoon. I listened closely as the pitch of my aunt's voice shifted from confident to highly defensive. "What do you mean you need a verification of liquid assets?" Brenda demanded, standing up from her chair. "I already wired $250,000 into your escrow account. That is hard money. That proves I am a serious buyer." The silence stretching across the line indicated the broker was calmly explaining the fundamental rules of high-end real estate. Bridging two distinct property transactions is a dangerous high-wire act. Brenda was relying on the Poconos timber sale to fund the Florida purchase. The mountain cabin was scheduled to close on Thursday afternoon. The coastal condominium was scheduled to close on Friday morning. She planned to receive the corporate cash on Thursday and wire the remaining $950,000 balance southward overnight. But the Florida seller was growing nervous. They required a certified bank statement proving the buyer possessed the remaining liquidity before they would authorize the final Friday morning walkthrough. They refused to accept a pending out-of-state transaction as a valid guarantee. "I do not have liquid cash sitting idle in a checking account right this second," Brenda snapped, pacing the length of the dining room rug. "My capital is tied up in my mother's estate. The commercial settlement clears on Thursday. I will have your funds on Friday morning exactly as we agreed." Another tense pause followed. The broker delivered an ultimatum. "You cannot threaten to cancel my contract," Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with genuine panic. "I waived the financing contingencies. If you terminate the agreement now, the seller keeps my deposit. You cannot keep $250,000 just because you are impatient." The reality of her fraudulent architecture was finally closing in on her. The broker did not care about her excuses. He informed her that if she could not produce a certified letter of guaranteed funds by Tuesday evening, the seller would declare a breach of contract, retain the stolen earnest money, and place the condominium back on the open market. Brenda ended the call without saying goodbye. She dropped the phone onto the dining table. For the first time since my grandmother passed away, the arrogant mask slipped entirely. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. She stared at the floral wallpaper, attempting to calculate a mathematical equation that had no viable solution. She picked the phone back up and dialed a new sequence of numbers. She walked out of the dining room and retreated into the narrow galley kitchen, pushing the swinging wooden door shut behind her. She assumed the closed door provided privacy. She forgot that the historic townhouse featured cast-iron ventilation grates connecting the rooms. I remained on the floor near the baseboard, sorting the silver forks. I could hear every frantic syllable echoing through the metal ductwork. Brenda had dialed her primary commercial bank. She bypassed the standard customer service representatives and demanded to speak directly with her assigned lending officer. The manufactured warmth was entirely gone from her tone. She sounded like a drowning woman negotiating with the ocean. "I need a short-term bridge loan," she pleaded, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Just $950,000 for 72 hours. I have a guaranteed commercial real estate closing happening this Thursday. I can pay the principal back by Friday afternoon with interest." The lending officer asked for collateral. Brenda offered the retail inventory of her home decor boutique. She offered the commercial lease. She offered her luxury vehicle. The rejection was swift and merciless. Through the metal grate, I heard her raise her voice to a desperate scream. "What do you mean my debt-to-income ratio is too high?" Brenda shrieked. "My boutique is going through a temporary seasonal slump. You are looking at outdated tax returns. I am the executor of a multi-million-dollar estate. I am inheriting a fortune this week. You just need to advance me the funds today. The bank refused to lend nearly $1 million to a retail business owner drowning in compounding credit card debt. They did not care about an unverified inheritance. Banks deal in verified collateral, not desperate promises. Brenda hurled her phone against the kitchen wall. The device struck the plaster with a sharp crack before clattering onto the tile floor. I sat back on my heels, wrapping a silver butter knife in dark felt. I categorized the entire sequence of events with cold detachment. The dominoes were lined up in a flawless row. Brenda had trapped herself in a lethal financial vice. She had stolen $250,000 from Summit Ridge Hospitality, redirecting corporate earnest money into a Southern escrow account she did not own. Because she waived the standard contingencies to secure the luxury property, that deposit was now categorized as hard money. If she failed to produce the remaining balance by tomorrow evening, the Florida seller would seize the funds. She would lose the stolen cash before she ever sat down at the title company in Philadelphia. The moment the Florida contract collapsed, the commercial developers in Pennsylvania would demand their deposit back. Brenda would have zero capital to return to them. Summit Ridge Hospitality would immediately file a lawsuit for fraud. Federal investigators would trace the wire transfer across state lines, uncovering the embezzlement. She was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, severe civil penalties, and total financial ruin. Her entire existence relied on the Poconos property clearing underwriting smoothly on Thursday afternoon. She needed that $4 million cash injection to cover the stolen funds and finalize her coastal escape. She believed the yellowed 15-year-old will was her golden ticket to salvation. The kitchen doors swung open. Brenda stepped back into the dining room. She had smoothed her hair and straightened her silk blouse, attempting to reconstruct her shattered composure. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her jaw was set with a rigid, terrifying determination. "Pack the rest of the silver into the moving boxes," Daisy Brenda instructed, her voice tight and clipped. "I have errands to run. We need to be ready for the commercial settlement on Thursday. This family transition is moving forward exactly as planned." I did not look up from my task. "I will have everything boxed up, Aunt Brenda," I replied evenly. She grabbed her designer handbag and marched out the front door. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place, leaving me alone in the quiet townhouse. I finished cataloging the vintage silver. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked over to the dining table. I picked up my plain canvas tote bag. Inside, resting beneath a spare cardigan and a notebook, was the thick red wax envelope containing Evelyn's irrevocable trust. The legal document carried the weight of a loaded weapon. My aunt was currently driving through the streets of Philadelphia, desperately searching for a miracle to save her collapsing empire. She was blind to the reality that her fate was already sealed in ink. The closing table was no longer just a meeting to dispute a property deed. It was going to be the exact location of her execution. I slung the tote bag over my shoulder, preparing for the final act. I had one more invitation to receive before the trap snapped shut. The delusion of a narcissist requires constant external validation. A theft is only truly satisfying to Brenda if she can rebrand the crime as a heroic rescue mission and force her victims to applaud the effort. On Wednesday evening, my cellular phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The glowing screen displayed a group text message sent to the surviving branches of the Campbell family tree. "Be there at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," the message read. "Commonwealth land and title. Dress nicely. We are closing a chapter and securing our future. This is a historic family transition." She could have signed the closing documents in private. The commercial developers would have strongly preferred a quiet, swift transaction without an audience. But Brenda could not resist taking a victory lap. She needed her younger brother David to sit in a leather chair and watch her wield supreme executive authority over their childhood memories. She needed her nephew Liam to look up from his digital screens and admire her perceived financial prowess. Most importantly, she needed her mousy niece to witness the final liquidation of the forest. She was dragging us to the title company to cement her status as the undisputed matriarch of the bloodline. She was attempting to rewrite history, placing herself at the center of the narrative as the savior who rescued the estate from imaginary debts. I read the text message 3 times. The sheer audacity of her invitation was breathtaking. She was summoning her relatives to watch her commit federal wire fraud. She was currently being hunted by a Florida real estate broker demanding a verification of funds she did not possess. Her entire coastal escape hinged on this singular mountain transaction clearing underwriting. The pressure inside her mind had to be suffocating, yet she was prioritizing a theatrical coronation over basic caution. I drafted a short, polite reply. "I will see you tomorrow, Aunt Brenda." Thursday morning arrived with a heavy overcast sky. The gray light filtering through my bedroom window matched the cold, detached calculation settling in my chest. An archivist understands that physical presentation dictates how others perceive your value. If you look like a background character, people will ignore you, allowing you to observe their true nature undetected. I opened my closet and bypassed the tailored blazers and structured wool coats. I reached for a beige knit cardigan. It was shapeless. It was the color of dry dust. It was the exact uniform of the obedient, invisible girl Brenda believed me to be. I paired the sweater with a simple cotton blouse and practical flat shoes. Camouflage requires strict discipline. I pulled my hair into a low, severe knot at the nape of my neck. I looked into the mirror and saw a woman who posed zero threat to a luxury real estate transaction. I walked into the dining room and approached the mahogany table. My plain canvas tote bag rested on the polished wood. I unzipped the main compartment. The thick envelope sealed with red wax rested securely inside. The Daisy Campbell Irrevocable Living Trust was safe. Beside it, I placed the photocopied folder containing the restrictive covenants and the 50-year no-sale clause. I zipped the bag shut. The canvas exterior looked suited for carrying library books or knitting supplies. It did not look like an instrument of financial execution. Driving through the congested avenues of Philadelphia requires intense patience. I navigated the dense afternoon traffic heading toward the commercial business district. The rhythmic thrum of my car engine provided a steady soundtrack to my racing thoughts. I pictured Uncle David driving his own vehicle toward the same destination. He was a man who yielded to pressure to avoid friction. He loved the Poconos cabin deeply, but lacked the rigid spine required to defend the timber against his older sister's relentless demands. He was driving to the title company believing he was about to watch his childhood sanctuary vanish into a corporate bank account. He assumed the battle was already lost. I pulled into the sprawling parking lot of Commonwealth Land and Title at 10 minutes before 2 o'clock. The agency occupied a sleek, modern building constructed entirely of steel and tinted glass. It was a fortress of administrative bureaucracy designed to process millions of dollars with cold efficiency. I scanned the painted parking spaces. Brenda had already arrived. Her silver-leased Mercedes took up 2 distinct spots near the front entrance, an arrogant display of entitlement. A few rows down, I recognized David's sensible sedan and Liam's impractical sports car. The captive audience was fully assembled. They were waiting inside, ready to play their assigned roles in my aunt's grand stage play. I parked my vehicle near the rear edge of the lot, far away from the front doors. I turned off the ignition and gathered my tote bag. As I reached for the door handle, a dark gray town car turned into the space directly adjacent to mine. Marcus Thorne stepped out into the humid autumn air. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit tailored with ruthless precision. His posture was perfectly straight, projecting the unyielding authority of his profession. In his right hand, he carried a slim leather briefcase holding the institutional weight of the legal system. He looked like a man arriving to dismantle a corrupt corporation. I stepped out of my sedan, gripping the woven straps of my canvas bag. We stood in the parking lot, separated by a few feet of painted asphalt. We did not exchange a verbal greeting. We did not review our strategy or whisper last-minute instructions. The architecture of the trap was already finalized and armed. Marcus locked his town car. I adjusted the beige cardigan over my shoulders. We exchanged a single brief nod. We walked side by side toward the revolving glass doors of the building. The visual contrast between us was stark. The sharp, imposing estate attorney and the unassuming librarian. A casual observer would never assume we were walking into the same room with the exact same objective. The security guard stationed in the main lobby tipped his hat as we passed the marble front desk. We approached the bank of elevators. I pressed the upward call button. The metallic doors slid open with a soft chime. We stepped inside the mirrored cab. As the elevator ascended toward the third floor, the mechanical hum filled the confined space. I thought about Greg Harrison, the commercial developer waiting upstairs. He represented the apex of predatory real estate. He viewed the Campbell family as naive amateurs handing over a gold mine. He was sitting in a leather chair expecting a seamless acquisition. He was entirely unaware that the $250,000 he had wired into escrow was currently being held hostage by a luxury condominium association in South Florida. The financial collision waiting for him was profound. The third floor belonged entirely to the settlement agency. The corridors were lined with frosted glass walls, allowing vague silhouettes to be seen from the hallway, but obscuring the fine details of the negotiations happening inside. The reception area was eerily quiet. A receptionist directed us down the primary hallway toward Conference Room B. As we approached the heavy glass door, the sound of my aunt's voice leaked into the corridor. She was speaking loudly, dominating the acoustic space. Through the translucent glass, I could see the distinct shapes of the participants. Brenda was standing at the head of a long boardroom table, gesturing expansively. The corporate developers from Summit Ridge Hospitality were seated along the right side, flanked by their own legal counsel. David and Liam were seated on the left, looking diminished and exhausted. I rested my hand on the stainless steel door handle. The tension was at its absolute peak. My grandmother had spent her entire life building a legacy rooted in the solid earth of the mountains. Brenda was trying to trade that earth for a fleeting illusion of coastal wealth. The illusion was about to shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the room. Conference Room B felt like a refrigerated vault. The temperature was kept intentionally low to prevent tempers from flaring during multi-million-dollar commercial negotiations. The centerpiece of the sterile space was an expansive mahogany boardroom table surrounded by heavy leather executive chairs. The room smelled of fresh printer toner, bitter corporate coffee, and expensive cologne. It was the exact environment where legacies were erased and converted into digital currency. Brenda occupied the head chair, positioned like a monarch at the top of the table. Her posture was rigid and her chin tilted upward, projecting absolute authority. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer with a silk scarf draped perfectly over her collarbone. She looked like a woman preparing to sign a historic peace treaty rather than a thief preparing to steal a forest. To her right sat Greg Harrison, the primary representative from Summit Ridge Hospitality. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, revealing the heavy gold Rolex encircling his wrist. Beside him sat his corporate legal counsel, a sharp-looking woman typing silently on a thin silver laptop. On the left side of the table, my Uncle David and my cousin Liam were slumped in their respective chairs. They projected a quiet aura of total defeat, having surrendered the mountain cabin in their minds days ago. I walked through the frosted glass door, keeping my gaze lowered to the carpet. I chose a seat in the far corner of the room, away from the primary negotiation zone. I placed my canvas tote bag onto the floor next to my sensible flat shoes. I folded my hands in my lap, assuming the physical posture of a minor spectator. Marcus Thorne entered directly behind me. He did not take a seat. He remained standing near the back wall, holding his slim leather briefcase. He looked like an impartial administrative observer, a neutral fixture of the corporate ecosystem. Brenda barely spared us a glance. She assumed Marcus was simply a junior clerk from the title agency assigned to fetch files or pour water. The closing attorney sat at the opposite end of the mahogany expanse. His brass nameplate identified him as Lawrence Mitchell. He was a meticulous older gentleman wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a faded tweed suit. He projected the distinct aura of a man who had reviewed thousands of property deeds and possessed zero tolerance for clerical errors. Lawrence Mitchell began distributing thick stacks of paper, arranging them in precise geometric piles. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. The settlement officer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he explained the mechanical sequence of the closing process. He noted that the funds from the commercial developer were currently resting securely in the agency escrow account. He explicitly stated that those funds were waiting for the final signature on the warranty deed to trigger the outward wire transfer to the estate. When the settlement officer mentioned the outward wire transfer, a distinct flicker of pure hunger illuminated my aunt's eyes. That specific transfer was the exact mechanism she desperately needed to save her Florida condominium from defaulting. She leaned forward, gripping the padded armrests of her leather chair. Her knuckles turned white from the pressure. Before Lawrence Mitchell could slide the final warranty deed down the length of the table, Brenda raised a manicured hand. She demanded the floor. She needed to deliver her theatrical monologue to validate her imaginary sacrifice. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice adopting that familiar manufactured tremor. "This is a profoundly bittersweet afternoon for my family." She spoke about Evelyn, utilizing a tone dripping with fabricated sorrow. She claimed my grandmother would have wanted the bloodline to evolve to shed the heavy financial burdens of the past and embrace a lucrative modern future. She categorized the liquidation of the historic timber as a heartbreaking but necessary duty. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue, ensuring the corporate developers registered her emotional toll. I sat in my corner chair observing the performance. The fake tears in the conference room mirrored the stolen rings in the hospital. Both actions were designed to extract maximum value from a dead woman while pretending to honor her memory. Uncle David looked down at his lap, unable to watch his older sister desecrate their mother's sanctuary. Greg Harrison tapped his index finger against the crystal face of his gold Rolex, signaling his supreme impatience. He did not care about family history or emotional speeches. He only cared about finalizing the acquisition so his demolition crews could bulldoze the ancient oak trees in the morning. Time was money, and Brenda was wasting his. Lawrence Mitchell nodded politely, indulging the performance out of professional courtesy. When Brenda finally concluded her speech, the settlement officer pushed the primary deed of transfer down the length of the table. The crisp document came to rest directly in front of her. He reached into his suit jacket and handed her a heavy metal fountain pen. This was the absolute peak of the tension. The atmosphere inside the room contracted. Brenda wrapped her fingers around the cool barrel of the pen. She lowered the metal tip toward the signature line. The ambient noise in the room seemed to evaporate entirely. The mechanical hum of the air conditioning faded into the background. The ticking of the developer's watch sounded like a metronome counting down to a catastrophic detonation. Brenda hovered the ink a fraction of an inch above the paper, preparing to commit federal wire fraud and finalize her embezzlement. She was seconds away from destroying her own life. Marcus Thorne moved. His leather shoes made a soft, deliberate sound against the commercial carpet. He did not shout. He did not slam his fist against the table or create a chaotic scene. Justice does not require theatrics. It only requires the correct paperwork. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said, his steady baritone voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "I believe there is a fundamental defect in the chain of title." Marcus opened his leather briefcase. He extracted the plain manila folder containing the certified copy of the Evelyn Campbell Irrevocable Living Trust. He walked toward the center of the room and placed the folder flat onto the polished mahogany surface. With a smooth, measured motion, he slid the thick packet across the table. The paper glided silently, coming to a rest directly over the signature line of the fraudulent deed, blocking Brenda from signing her name. Brenda froze. The metal pen hovered suspended in midair. She stared at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake uncoiling on the boardroom table. "Who are you?" she demanded, her manufactured warmth evaporating instantly into sharp panic. "What is this garbage?" Lawrence Mitchell ignored her outburst. "A title officer possesses a strict legal obligation to review any document presented during a settlement that challenges the ownership of the property." He pulled the trust document toward his chest, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He turned to the first page. I sat perfectly still in my corner chair. I did not blink. I watched the specific muscles in the closing attorney's face tighten. The administrative boredom vanished from his features, replaced by acute professional alarm. His eyes darted across the notarized seals, the execution dates, and the rigid legal verbiage. He flipped to the 7th page, verifying the appointed successor trustee. He flipped to the 9th page, reading the restrictive covenants. The room went dead silent. The corporate legal counsel stopped typing on her silver laptop. Greg Harrison lowered his wrist, his posture shifting from impatient to highly alert. Uncle David looked up, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Lawrence Mitchell slowly lowered the document. He looked directly at Brenda. His expression held the cold, unyielding judgment of the institutional system. I shifted my gaze toward my aunt. The color was draining from her cheeks in real time. The flushed, confident pink of her skin faded into a sickly, translucent pale. The grand illusion was shattering. The walls of her invisible trap were snapping shut, and the crushing weight of her impending reality was finally settling into the sterile air of the conference room. The document had spoken, and the echo was about to deafen everyone in the room. Lawrence Mitchell removed his wire-rimmed glasses and placed them gently onto the polished mahogany table. The settlement officer did not look angry or surprised. He looked weary, the way a seasoned administrative professional does when a routine transaction suddenly morphs into a profound legal nightmare. He tapped his index finger against the thick manila folder Marcus Thorne had just provided. "Ma'am, you are not the trustee," Lawrence Mitchell said, his voice carrying the flat, unyielding tone of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You have zero legal authority to sell this property." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the sudden vacuum of air that occurs right before a structural collapse. Brenda stared at the settlement officer. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She looked down at the fraudulent warranty deed resting near her hands, and then back up at the elderly man. The manufactured elegance she had carried into the room began to fracture. "That is absurd," Brenda stammered, her voice rising into a sharp, frantic register. "I am the eldest daughter. I am the sole executor of the estate. I have the last will and testament right here in my bag." She began digging frantically into her designer purse, her manicured nails catching on the leather lining. Marcus Thorne stepped forward. He did not raise his voice to match her rising panic. He spoke with surgical precision, slicing through her delusion with cold, legal facts. "The testamentary document you are holding was drafted 15 years ago," Marcus explained, keeping his hands resting calmly by his sides. "My firm drafted a superseding estate plan for your mother 6 months prior to her passing. She executed an irrevocable living trust. Under Pennsylvania law, a properly funded trust bypasses the probate courts entirely. The property does not belong to the estate. It is currently vested in the legal entity of the trust. Your outdated will is entirely worthless paper." Brenda gripped the edge of the heavy table. The skin across her knuckles stretched tight and white. She turned her head, glaring at Marcus with unfiltered venom. "Then who is the trustee?" Brenda demanded, her voice cracking under the severe strain. "Who has the authority?" Marcus did not answer verbally. He simply shifted his gaze across the room, looking directly at the corner where I was seated. Slowly, every head in the conference room turned to follow his line of sight. Uncle David looked at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Cousin Liam finally dropped his cellular phone onto the table, staring at me as if I had just materialized through the wall. Greg Harrison, the commercial developer, narrowed his eyes, assessing me as a sudden, unknown variable. I sat perfectly still in my beige cardigan with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not shrink under their collective stare. I met my aunt's gaze, offering her the exact same flat, obedient smile I had given her at the country club brunch. "The sole trustee and exclusive beneficiary is Daisy Campbell," Marcus stated firmly. "She is the only living person possessing the legal capacity to authorize a deed transfer for the Poconos estate." Brenda let out a short, hysterical laugh. It was a chaotic sound devoid of any real humor. "Daisy," she scoffed, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Daisy is an archivist. She sorts old paper. She does not understand commercial real estate. I am managing this transition for the good of the family. She will sign whatever I tell her to sign." Lawrence Mitchell cleared his throat, recapturing the attention of the room. He picked up his wire-rimmed glasses and slid them back onto his face. Even if Ms. Campbell were inclined to authorize the sale, she is legally prohibited from doing so, Lawrence Mitchell announced. He flipped the trust document to the 9th page. He pressed the paper flat against the table and began to read aloud for the benefit of the corporate buyers. Restrictive covenant and deed. Restriction. The settlement officer recited, his voice echoing off the frosted glass walls. The trustee is strictly prohibited from subdividing, commercializing, or selling the aforementioned acreage to any corporate development entity for a period of 50 years. The property must remain a residential nature preserve or transfer to a recognized state conservation organization. Any violation of this clause triggers immediate forfeiture of the deed to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Greg Harrison shifted his weight in his leather executive chair. The impatience radiating from the developer vanished, replaced by sharp, predatory anger. He was a businessman who calculated risk down to the decimal point. He had just spent thousands of dollars on surveyors and grading reports for a mountain resort that was legally impossible to construct. He turned his head, looking at his corporate legal counsel. The sharp woman typing on the silver laptop had stopped moving. She met her client's gaze and offered a single grim nod, confirming the devastating reality. A 50-year restrictive covenant tied to a state forfeiture clause was an ironclad barrier. No title insurance company on earth would ever underwrite a policy against it. The boutique resort was dead. "Kill the acquisition!" Greg Harrison ordered, his voice dropping into a harsh, gravelly register. "The deal is dead. Terminate the contract and release the earnest money back to our corporate account immediately." The corporate counsel turned toward Lawrence Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, please process the release forms for the Summit Ridge Hospitality escrow deposit. We require the return of our $250,000 before the close of business today." Lawrence Mitchell frowned. He opened the administrative ledger sitting on his side of the table, tracing his finger down a column of printed numbers. He looked up, shaking his head. "Commonwealth Land and Title is not holding any earnest money for this transaction," Lawrence Mitchell stated plainly. "Our ledger indicates a zero balance for the buyer deposit." The corporate counsel narrowed her eyes. "That is impossible. Our accounting department wired $250,000 last week to secure the expedited 30-day closing window. I have the confirmation receipt in my digital file." Lawrence Mitchell tapped his pen against his ledger. "You may have wired the funds, counselor, but you did not wire them to this agency." The temperature in the room plummeted. The distinct scent of impending financial ruin flooded the space. Greg Harrison slowly turned his head, fixing his gaze on my aunt. The developer was no longer looking at a grieving family member. He was looking at a thief who had just stolen $250,000 from his corporation. "Where did you instruct my accounting department to send the wire?" Greg Harrison asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. Brenda could not speak. The theatrical tears she had employed earlier were entirely gone, replaced by genuine, unhinged panic. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. The grand illusion had collapsed, burying her underneath the rubble. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had shattered her leg. She had bridged the two transactions, assuming the Poconos sale would close smoothly today. She needed this corporate cash to cover the stolen earnest money and fund the remainder of her Florida luxury condominium tomorrow morning. Now the mountain cabin was legally locked for half a century. The developer was demanding his stolen deposit back. The Florida seller was demanding proof of funds by tomorrow. She possessed zero liquidity to satisfy either party. She had committed federal wire fraud by directing corporate funds across state lines into a personal escrow account she had zero legal authority to utilize. Uncle David leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, trembling exhale. He finally understood the depth of his sister's deception. She had not been trying to save the family from imaginary medical debts. She had been trying to bulldoze their childhood sanctuary to fund a coastal vacation home. "This transaction is formally voided," Lawrence Mitchell announced, terminating the silence. He picked up a heavy rubber stamp from his desk, pressing it firmly onto an ink pad. He brought the stamp down onto the fraudulent warranty deed. The loud mechanical thud echoed through the conference room, printing the word "void" in stark red letters across the signature line. I stood up from my chair in the corner. I reached down and picked up my plain canvas tote bag, sliding the woven straps over my shoulder. I smoothed the front of my beige cardigan. I walked across the plush corporate carpet, stopping directly behind the empty chair next to my aunt. Brenda was staring blankly at the red ink on the table. Her jaw trembled. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and hollow, pleading for a rescue that was never going to arrive. She wanted me to be the simple, obedient girl again. She wanted me to fix the catastrophic damage she had inflicted upon herself. I looked down at her, feeling zero pity. I thought about Evelyn's bare finger in the hospital room. I thought about the neon spray paint marking the ancient oak trees for execution. I guess you will have to cancel the Boca condo. I said, my voice soft, flat, and entirely devoid of mercy. I turned my back on her and walked toward the frosted glass door, leaving her trapped inside the sterile room with the furious corporate developer she had just defrauded. I stood near the heavy frosted glass door with my hand resting on the stainless steel handle. The sterile air inside Conference Room B had turned stagnant. I had intended to walk away and let the corporate machinery consume my aunt, but the sheer velocity of the fallout anchored my feet to the commercial carpet. The destruction of an arrogant predator is not a swift event. It is a slow, methodical dismantling, and I am an archivist who honors the obligation to witness history. Greg Harrison did not possess the mild temperament of a disappointed buyer. He was a ruthless commercial developer who viewed stolen capital as a personal insult. He pushed his leather executive chair backward with such force it slammed into the credenza behind him. He stood up, planting both hands flat on the mahogany table. "You are going to initiate a wire reversal this exact second," Greg Harrison commanded, his voice dropping into a lethal predatory register. "You are going to return my $250,000, or I will ensure you never see the outside of a courtroom for the rest of your natural life." Brenda shrank back into her seat. The rigid, authoritative posture she had maintained for weeks evaporated. She looked remarkably small. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched the edges of her charcoal blazer. "I do not have access to the funds today," Brenda stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "The Florida escrow agency is holding the deposit. I just need a few days to sort out the logistics and negotiate a refund." The corporate legal counsel seated next to the developer stopped typing on her silver laptop. She closed the screen with a sharp, definitive snap. She looked at Brenda with the cold, clinical detachment of an apex predator observing wounded prey. "You do not have a few days," the corporate counsel stated, her tone devoid of any professional courtesy. "You signed a legally binding letter of intent, representing yourself as the sole executor of a multi-million-dollar estate. You utilized fraudulent documentation to induce Summit Ridge Hospitality into wiring $250,000. That meets the statutory definition of civil fraud and intentional misrepresentation. My firm will file a lawsuit against you personally before the courthouse closes this afternoon. We will place a lien on your boutique inventory, we will garnish your personal bank accounts, and we will seize your luxury vehicle." Brenda began to hyperventilate. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts. The silk scarf draped around her neck suddenly looked like a tightly pulled noose. She reached up, clawing at the fabric to loosen it. "I cannot pay you back if the Florida seller keeps the hard money deposit," Brenda gasped, pleading with the sharp attorney. "If this mountain cabin does not close, I am in breach of my Southern contract. They will retain your capital as a penalty. You have to give me time to fix this." Marcus Thorne remained standing near the back wall, holding his slim leather briefcase. He observed the chaotic exchange with strict administrative boredom. He stepped forward, interjecting himself into the collapsing narrative. "The civil liability is the least of your concerns," Marcus informed my aunt, his steady baritone voice slicing through her panic. Brenda whipped her head around, staring at the estate attorney with wide, terrified eyes. "When you instructed this commercial developer to transfer corporate funds across state lines into a personal escrow account, you lacked the legal authority to receive them," Marcus explained, reciting the legal statutes with chilling precision. "By bridging the transaction from Pennsylvania to Florida, you utilized interstate communication networks to commit financial theft. That elevates your deception from a local civil dispute to a severe federal crime." The room grew profoundly quiet. Even Greg Harrison paused his angry pacing to listen to the exact parameters of the legal snare. Wire fraud is heavily prosecuted. Marcus continued maintaining his steady gaze. The federal authorities do not care that you intended to pay the developer back after finalizing your coastal purchase. The crime occurred the exact second the stolen funds crossed the state border. You are currently facing a severe federal indictment, and the jurisdiction belongs entirely to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The carefully curated image Brenda had spent her entire adult life building shattered into a million jagged fragments. The wealthy boutique owner, the sophisticated metropolitan traveler, the matriarch of the Campbell family, all those false identities disintegrated inside the cold conference room. She was exposed as a desperate thief drowning in retail debt who had gambled her freedom on a forged signature and lost everything. Uncle David sat on the left side of the table, staring at his older sister with a mixture of profound horror and deep disgust. The quiet optometrist who had spent his entire life avoiding friction finally located his spine. "You tried to steal our mother's legacy to buy a condo," David whispered, shaking his head slowly. "You lied to my face. You sat at the country club and told me the estate was bankrupt. You invited us here today to watch you secure your own theft, and you expected us to applaud you." "I was trying to save us," Brenda cried out, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. These were not the performative tears she had utilized earlier. These were the frantic, terrified tears of a woman realizing her entire existence was over. "You were trying to save yourself," David corrected, his voice hardening into unfamiliar stone. "You are a parasite, Brenda. Do not ever contact me or my family again." David stood up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not look back. He walked past the corporate developers and exited through the frosted glass door, leaving the shattered matriarch behind. Cousin Liam followed immediately, holding his cellular phone tightly against his chest. Liam realized the endless stream of family capital had permanently dried up. He scurried out of the room, eager to distance himself from a looming federal investigation. Brenda was entirely alone. The captive audience she had summoned to witness her grand coronation had abandoned her. She turned her desperate, frantic gaze toward the only relative remaining in the room. She looked at me. She pushed herself out of her leather chair, stumbling forward. Her high heels caught on the edge of the commercial carpet. She caught herself on the mahogany table, leaving sweaty palm prints on the polished wood. She looked at my plain beige cardigan and my sensible flat shoes, attempting to locate the obedient, invisible niece she had controlled for nearly 3 decades. "Daisy, please?" Brenda begged, her voice cracking under the severe emotional strain. "You have to fix this. You are the trustee. You have the legal authority. You can sign a waiver. You can authorize the timber sale. You can save me." She reached out a trembling hand, grasping the fabric of my sleeve. Her imported perfume smelled sour, mixed with the acrid scent of cold sweat. "I am your family," Brenda sobbed, pulling my arm slightly. "Your grandmother would be entirely heartbroken to see you doing this to me. You cannot let them send me to a federal prison. I will lose the boutique. I will lose everything. Please, Daisy, you are a good girl. You have to save me." I looked down at her manicured fingers clutching my cheap knit sweater. I felt zero pity. I felt zero obligation. I felt the quiet, solid strength of the ancient oak trees standing tall in the mountain forest. She was attempting to weaponize family loyalty one final time, relying on my conditioned silence to rescue her from her own greed. I reached down and peeled her trembling fingers off my sleeve one by one. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my beige cardigan, ensuring my appearance remained neat and orderly. I looked directly into her terrified, hollow eyes. "I am just a quiet archivist, Brenda," I said, my tone flat, detached, and devoid of any mercy. "The grown-ups are handling the estate now." I turned my back on her and grasped the stainless steel handle of the conference room door. I pushed the heavy glass open, stepping out into the quiet administrative corridor. I did not run. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who had just finished filing a highly important historical record. As the heavy door began to swing shut behind me, I heard the final sounds of the collapse. Greg Harrison instructed his corporate legal counsel to contact the local authorities immediately. The sharp tapping of keyboard keys resumed, and then the screaming began. It was a loud, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated terror, echoing off the frosted glass walls and spilling into the hallway. Brenda realized the trap was fully locked. The invisible snare had tightened around her throat, and there was no escape. I walked toward the elevator bank, listening to the sound of her total ruin. The grand stage play was officially over, and the true cost of her admission had finally come due. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass door of Conference Room B clicked shut behind me, sealing my aunt's fate inside a sterile corporate vault. The transition from a bitter autumn to a vibrant spring in the Pocono Mountains is a slow, deliberate process. The thick ice covering the deep glacial lake fractures and melts over several weeks. The dense canopy of the forest gradually regains its vivid emerald color. Nature operates on a timeline completely immune to human greed and commercial demands. This morning I walked down the long gravel driveway carrying a coarse, bristled brush and a bucket of warm, soapy water. I approached the ancient oak trees standing near the eastern property line. The toxic neon orange spray paint left by the commercial surveyors had faded significantly over the harsh winter, but remnants of the bright geometric symbols still clung to the deeply textured bark. I spent 2 uninterrupted hours scrubbing the trunks, washing away the final physical evidence of the corporate invasion. The majestic timber is officially secure. The 50-year restrictive covenant is firmly anchored in the county registry, shielding the 40 acres of pristine wilderness from any future demolition attempts. The $4.6 million estate remains an untouchable sanctuary. The architecture of my aunt's total destruction was finalized with breathtaking speed. When a person constructs a massive financial empire entirely out of stolen leverage, the resulting collapse is absolute and unforgiving. Brenda did not simply lose a commercial real estate transaction. She lost her freedom, her elite social standing, and her entire carefully curated identity. The timeline of her ruin unfolded exactly as Marcus Thorne had predicted during our strategic meeting. On the Friday morning following the aborted settlement, the luxury condominium seller in Boca Raton formally declared a severe breach of contract. Because Brenda failed to produce the certified verification of liquid funds for the remaining $950,000 balance, the Southern agency terminated the purchase agreement. They legally retained the stolen $250,000 earnest money deposit, classifying the transferred funds as a non-refundable punitive penalty. The corporate cash evaporated into the Florida coastline before the weekend even began. Greg Harrison did not accept the loss of his corporate capital with any measure of grace. Summit Ridge Hospitality deployed their massive legal department, launching a devastating civil lawsuit against Brenda for intentional misrepresentation and catastrophic civil fraud. They successfully petitioned the municipal court to place an immediate emergency lien on her high-end home decor boutique. Within 3 weeks, the commercial landlords evicted her failing business for missing the exorbitant monthly lease payments. The imported Italian ceramics and expensive velvet throw pillows were aggressively auctioned off for pennies to satisfy a tiny fraction of her outstanding retail debts. The civil litigation, however, was merely the prologue to her actual living nightmare. Because she explicitly authorized the transfer of corporate funds across state lines, utilizing a fraudulent premise, the federal authorities assumed primary jurisdiction over the crime. In late January, armed federal agents arrived at her historic Philadelphia townhouse. They carried empty cardboard boxes inside to confiscate her personal financial ledgers, banking records, and digital devices. She was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on 3 separate felony counts of wire fraud. She currently resides in a cramped, leased apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, awaiting her criminal trial. Her designer Milan handbags and her leased silver Mercedes sport utility vehicle are gone seized by bankruptcy trustees attempting to untangle her massive compounding liabilities. She surrendered her passport to the magistrate judge. She currently faces a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The family dynamics shifted permanently in the wake of the conference room disaster. Abusers rely heavily on the silent compliance of their relatives to maintain their dominant authority. When the grand illusion finally shatters, the captive audience walks away forever. Uncle David cut all communication with his older sister. He changed his cellular phone number and focused entirely on his optometry practice, discovering a profound sense of genuine peace once the constant demands for his financial submission ceased. Cousin Liam experienced a harsh collision with adult reality. His leased sports car was formally repossessed in late February. Without the imaginary promise of an impending massive inheritance funding his lavish lifestyle, he was forced to secure entry-level retail employment. The Campbell bloodline effectively pruned its own diseased branches. I remain exactly where I have always belonged. I am the dedicated archivist, the meticulous keeper of the historical records, and the quiet guardian of the beautiful legacy my grandmother built. I transitioned my professional role at the Philadelphia Historical Society to a permanent remote capacity, allowing me to manage the fragile municipal ledgers from the comfort of the mountain cabin. My daily commute now consists of walking down the hardwood hallway into the rear study. I sit behind the massive antique cedar desk, exactly where Evelyn taught me how to read the dangerous fine print. The heavy brass magnifying glass rests exactly where she left it all those years ago. The secret hidden compartment remains empty today, because the irrevocable living trust is now safely filed inside a reinforced steel fireproof safe bolted to the foundation. I did not need to engage in a vulgar screaming match to secure this monumental victory. I did not need to throw heavy glass objects against a kitchen wall or deliver a theatrical monologue dripping with manufactured tears. I simply needed to observe the toxic environment, collect the necessary authentic documentation, and let the unfeeling institutional systems execute their rigid administrative functions. Justice in the real world does not look like a cinematic physical brawl. It looks like a meticulous older settlement attorney reading a restrictive covenant aloud in a freezing corporate boardroom. It looks like a certified wire transfer receipt placed squarely on a polished mahogany table. It looks like the objective truth walking slowly and deliberately toward the daylight, exposing every single lie hidden securely in the shadows. I walked up the wooden steps onto the wraparound stone porch. The afternoon mountain air felt incredibly clean, carrying the sharp scent of fresh pine needles and blooming spring wildflowers. I settled into the old, woven rocking chair, looking out over the tranquil expanse of the thawing glacial lake. I held a ceramic mug securely in both hands. It was Evelyn's favorite mug, slightly chipped near the curved handle, but remarkably sturdy and warm against my palms. The dark herbal tea steeped perfectly, sending a thin, delicate ribbon of steam ascending into the crisp atmosphere. I took a slow, methodical sip, letting the rich, earthy flavor ground me firmly in the present moment. The magnificent legacy of the forest was secure. The estate was completely solvent and protected. The arrogant predators had been systematically removed from our fragile ecosystem. There is a distinct, unique power possessed by the silent, watchful observer. Arrogant people will continually underestimate the woman who sits quietly in the corner wearing sensible flat shoes and a plain beige cardigan. They will incorrectly assume her lack of volume equates to a profound lack of intelligence. They will willingly hand her the very legal weapons she needs to dismantle their corrupt empires, firmly believing she is far too timid to pull the trigger. Never mistake a quiet daughter for a weak one. Subscribe for more stories where dignity gets the last word.